Hello, Tam here. This is lesson 1, the circulatory system. Thought you might quite relate to this cartoon as the heart is much more detailed than we originally think. So please can you on your progress bar just rate your confidence for these 3 learning objectives. We're going to come back to them a couple of times throughout the lesson. Please can you pause the video and complete activity 1. It's a quick circulatory systems recall quiz. And here are the answers, so you might again want to just pause the video and check those. And here are some more answers, so again, just pause the video and check those. Next, please pause the video and complete activity 2. The ideal thing would be able to label the heart from memory. Try and do it without books or your notes, and then take a photo and upload it to your Teams channel. If you're really struggling, then come back to this video, and there's a prompt slide on the next slide which has got some key terms that might help you. So this is the prompt slide, and you might want to try and include these key terms on your diagram if you haven't already. Do try and identify which side is the left and which side is the right hand side of the heart as well, and what type of blood they carry. So pause the video if you need to use this slide. So here is the heart structure with all of its labels, and the first thing really that you want to do is to identify which side is left and which side is right, if the labels haven't already done that. So when you're doing that, the easiest way to imagine is that you're looking at the heart of someone else. So someone else is facing you and you're looking at their heart, almost like you're a doctor looking at your patient's heart during an operation or something like that. So the first thing is that this would be their left hand side and this would be their right hand side. Next thing we want to do is identify which side carries oxygenated blood and which side carries deoxygenated blood. So here we can see that on the left hand side, blood is going to come back from the lungs into the heart via the pulmonary vein. So then the left hand side is actually going to carry oxygenated blood, whereas the right hand side is going to carry deoxygenated blood. The blood will flow through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, through the bicuspid valves, and then into the left ventricle. From here, the ventricles will squeeze the blood and it will travel up and through the aorta and then to the rest of the body. The blood will then come back from the body and it's going to be now deoxygenated because it's going to come into the right hand side of the heart and it's dropped all of its oxygen off at the respiring tissues, and it's going to return through the vena cava. Now there's actually 2 of these, so you'll see here we've got an inferior vena cava, which means that the blood from the lower body, so anything sort of lower than the heart, is going to come in via the inferior vena cava, and then anything from the upper body, so the arms and head, is going to come in via the superior vena cava, and that blood is going to flow into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valves and into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will then contract and the blood will be pushed via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. So here we've got a slightly different image of the heart, and it's quite good just to look at different images because you do need to memorise all of the different structures and they won't always give you the same picture to label. So a few things just that I'm going to point out on this slide here. So the first one is the aorta. The aorta is actually the biggest blood vessel in the body, and that's often quite easy to spot because here you can see it's obviously the biggest. Anything with pulmonary in is talking about the lungs. So here you can see that the pulmonary artery is going to be taking deoxygenated blood from the body out to the lungs. The blood will then be oxygenated in the lungs and return to the heart via the pulmonary vein. And you can see pulmonary veins are coming here. And there's actually 2 of them. You've got one on the right and one on the left, and it's the same with the artery. It kind of branches, and that's because obviously you have 2 lungs that are either side of the heart. Another thing to note here is that we've got this big structure down the centre here in green, and this is the septum. So the septum separates the oxygenated blood in the left-hand side of the heart and the deoxygenated blood in the right-hand side of the heart. It's also really important in the electrical conduction of the heart, so what controls the heartbeat. We'll actually come back to that in a lesson after Christmas. Another thing to note here is we've got some valves that we have to know the names of. So here in the right hand side of the heart we've got the tricuspid valves, okay, and these actually separate the right atrium and ventricle. And then on the left hand side of the heart we've got the bicuspid valves, and these separate the left atrium and also ventricle. And then our other really important valves actually sit at the base of the pulmonary artery and also aorta. You can't actually see the aorta because it's sort of tucked away, but here you can see there in blue, this is where you find the semilunar valves. They're called semilunar because they look a little bit like half moons. They're also called pocket valves, and they basically stop blood flowing back from the aorta or the pulmonary artery back into the ventricles. Another top tip for you is, because the pulmonary system is a little bit different from what you learn at school. The pulmonary, like when we're at school, we normally learn that oxygenated blood is carried in the arteries and deoxygenated blood in the veins, and it's actually the opposite in the pulmonary system. So one thing that might help you to remember this is that arteries, A for arteries, take blood away, A for away from the heart, whereas veins bring blood back to the heart. Okay, please can you pause the video and try activity 3 for this. We'd like you to imagine that you're a red blood cell and you've just arrived at the heart from the body, and please can you draw a flow diagram to show the flow of blood through the heart. Try and include all of the different vessels and also the valves. So pause the video and try that. And here are the answers. So you might want to again pause the video and just check that you've got the correct structures, see if you missed anything. Please can you pause the video and try these 3 questions on the cardiac cycle. Okay, so the cardiac cycle is basically the sequence of events or cycle of events that happen in one heartbeat. We're going to talk about these a little bit more over the next few slides. Valves in the heart prevent backflow of blood and also maintain pressure. And so they're really, really important, especially in the aorta and pulmonary arteries, to maintain high blood pressure and ensure the blood is moved to the right location. And you don't only find valves in the heart, you also find them in the veins. And again, they prevent backflow and maintain blood pressure. So they make sure that the blood moves through the veins back to the heart. So on this slide, we're going to talk through the cardiac cycle, and there's a few key things just to note before we do that. So the first thing is systole, this word, translates as contract. So for example, here you can see atrial systole. That basically means that the muscle surrounding the atria is going to contract. Diastole means relax. So here, ventricular diastole, that means the muscle surrounding the ventricles is going to relax. Another thing to note is when you get a change in volume, you also get a change in pressure. So for example, if I've got a box here with 5 particles in and I decrease the size of that box or the volume, I now have an increased pressure because the particles have less space, so they're hitting the walls of the box more. Okay, so a decrease in volume is going to increase the pressure, and the reverse is true as well. An increase in volume is going to decrease the pressure. So this is really important when you're looking at the cardiac cycle, because the cardiac cycle is basically the contractions of different parts of the heart to pump blood through the heart and to its desired location. And in the cardiac cycle, both sides of the heart are working at the same time. So the first thing that happens is, and because this is a cycle, we're just starting here, but obviously you could start anywhere if you're describing this process. So atrial and ventricular diastole. Now diastole translates as relax. So in this section of the cardiac cycle, all chambers are relax, and the blood is going to flow from an area of higher to lower pressure. So that's another thing to note, is that blood will always flow from higher to lower pressure. So the blood's going to move into the atria via the pulmonary veins and also vena cava. The next stage of the cardiac cycle is atrial systole and ventricular diastole. So over here you can see that the atria are contracting, and as they contract they decrease the volume and increase the pressure in both of the atria. So again, both sides of the heart are working at the same time, and the ventricles are relaxed, hence ventricular diastole. So what's happened here is that because the atria, when they contract, they increase the pressure in both those chambers because they've decreased the volume. And that means the blood is going to flow from an area of higher pressure. You can see I've put a little H there. So higher pressure in the atria into lower pressure in the ventricles. Okay, so the blood will follow those arrows and flow from the atria into the ventricles. The final stage in the cardiac cycle in our diagram is ventricular systole and atrial diastole. So at this point here, the systole we know means contract, so the ventricles are contracting and the atria are relaxing. Okay, now we mentioned on the last slide that valves maintain the direction of blood flow in the heart, so they stop or prevent backflow of blood, and that's really important. So what we can see here is when the ventricles contract, they generate higher pressure in the ventricles, and because the atria are relaxing, there's lower pressure in the atria. So blood will want to travel back into the atria, but to prevent that, the atrioventricular valves, or as we will refer to them, the tricuspid on the right hand side and the bicuspid on the left hand side, they slam shut and they prevent backflow of blood from the ventricles into the atria. And the valves that do open are the semilunar valves. Okay, so valves are kind of like one-way doors, they'll only open in a certain direction. So the semilunar valves will open and the blood will flow from a higher pressure in the ventricles to an area of lower pressure in the arteries. And the blood will flow away from the heart towards either the lungs or the body. And then the cycle will carry on. So then it will move back into the atrial and ventricular diastole. And again, one thing just to note here is what's going on with the valves. So it's really important that we know what areas are contracting and relaxing, the direction of blood flow. So again, blood always flows from an area of higher to lower pressure unless valves are in the way. And then we also want to know what's happening with the valves. Are they open or are they closed? So it might be a good idea just to pause the video and make some notes on the cardiac cycle. Next, I'd like you to have a go at activity 4. So on activity 4, there's a link to a really nice animation that shows the cardiac cycle and what's happening at each stage. So you might just want to step through each of those stages and just take note of exactly how the heart's contracting. Next, please can you pause the video and just go back to your progress bar that you completed at the start of the lesson, and just identify your confidence for these 3 learning objectives. So these are going to help us decide what activities we want to work on. And depending on how you rated yourself on the progress bar, please can you choose tasks that are going to help you progress the most. So the ideal thing would be to complete at least 2 and to give yourself about half an hour. Now the first ones are things that we've spoken about already, but the third one is a little bit harder. So we're actually going to talk about this third one on the next few slides, but do have a go at it if you feel confident to try it. Okay, so learning objective 3 was I can apply my knowledge to interpret a graph displaying pressure changes in the heart. So you need to be able to explain the pressure changes in the heart in terms of what's happening inside the heart, and also identify where the valves are open and closed and explain why in terms of pressure. Now this is something we mentioned earlier, but it's a really, really important point. Remember, blood will flow from an area of higher to lower pressure. Next, please can you pause the video and complete activity 6. Just one thing to note here is that this is relating to the left-hand side of the heart. So try and remember the names of the valves specifically found on the left-hand side of the heart. Pause the video, give that a go. So first of all, the valve between the atrium and the ventricle on the left-hand side of the heart is the bicuspid valve. This can also be called the left atrioventricular valve, but it's actually slightly better to call it the bicuspid valve. And when the pressure in the atrium is lower than pressure in the ventricles, the blood will want to start moving back into the atria, but to prevent backflow of the blood, the valve, the bicuspid valve, is going to slam shut and prevent that. When the pressure in the artery is lower than pressure in the ventricles, or specifically in the aorta, because we're on the left-hand side of the heart, is lower than the left ventricle, the aortic semilunar valve is going to be open. And that's because blood is going to flow from the ventricles into the aorta. And you might want to also at this point think about what stage of the cardiac cycle this is. So if the pressure is really high in the ventricles, it's going to be because the ventricles are contracting, so probably during ventricular systole. Next, the pressure in the atrium is higher than the pressure in the ventricles. So at this point, again, if the pressure is higher, it's because the volume's smaller, which means that the atrium is probably contracting. So the bicuspid valve is going to be the valve located between those two sections, and it's going to be open, and blood will flow from an area of higher to lower pressure, so from the atrium into the ventricle. Finally, pressure in the artery is higher than pressure in the ventricle. Now at this point here, that implies because the ventricle is a lower pressure, then the ventricle is going to be relaxed, so it will be in diastole because the volume will be bigger, therefore the pressure will be lower. And so to keep blood in the aorta, the aortic semilunar valve is going to close, slam shut, and keep high pressure blood in the aorta. And blood at this point here, we know as well, is going to be flowing and filling up the left-hand side of the heart. And this graph here shows the volume and pressure changes also in the left-hand side of the heart. At the bottom here, we've got the volume found in the ventricle, and at the top here, we've got the pressures in the different vessels and chambers. So the pressure in the aorta, in red, we've got the pressure in the left atrium in blue, and then in purple, the pressure in the left ventricle. Another really important thing to bear in mind when you're looking at this graph is to remember that an increase in volume is going to cause a decrease in pressure, and vice versa. A decrease in volume is going to cause an increase in pressure. So we need to be able to describe and explain what's happening in this graph. And I'm going to try and do that, and I'm going to link in this diagram here to identify what's happening in the different parts of the heart. So remember, we're looking at the left-hand side, so I'll just put a squiggle through the right-hand side. Okay, so the first thing in this graph is we've got atrial systole. Now, as we know, systole means contracting, so this is where the atria are contracting. So as the atria contracts, the volume in the atria decreases, and therefore the pressure increases. Now, as we know, blood will always flow from an area of higher to an area of lower pressure. So as the atria contract, the blood is going to flow from a higher pressure area in the atria into a lower pressure area in the ventricles. So let's compare that to the graph here. We can see as the atria are contracting, because the volume is decreasing, the pressure is increasing. And you can see that by this little bump in the blue line. Now, what you'll also see is that the purple line kind of follows that same trend. And that's because the blood is moving from the atria into the ventricles. So the pressure in the left ventricle is also increasing. Now, one thing to note here is that whichever line is higher, the blood is flowing from that area into the lower line. Okay, so here, for example, when the atria contracts, the blood is flowing from the atrium into the ventricle. So it's going from the blue into the purple section, if you like. We're going to come back to these numbers in a second. The second section on this graph is ventricular systole. So in ventricular systole, the ventricles are contracting, hence systole, and as they contract, again, the volume decreases and the pressure increases, this time in the ventricles. Now, we can see that really clearly if we look at this graph down here. So the volume in the ventricles decreases as they contract, and we can see that's reflected by an increase in pressure. So this purple line moves up, and the pressure in the ventricles, you can see at point number 2, actually overtakes or becomes higher than the pressure in the aorta. Now what that means is that now the pressure in the ventricle is higher than in the aorta. I'm going to put a little H for higher in the ventricle and an L for lower in the aorta, and that means that blood is going to flow from higher to lower pressure through the semilunar valves and into the aorta. Then the ventricles are going to relax, and so is the atrium has started to relax actually here in the second stage, but we're going to move into whole heart diastole, so both the atrium and the ventricle are going to be relaxed. And when they relax, the volume in the atrium and also ventricle will increase and the pressure will decrease. And then blood is going to flow from an area of higher to lower pressure back into the heart, okay, and it's going to fill up the heart via the pulmonary vein. Now what we can see here is that this is reflected in the pressure graph, because as the ventricle relaxes, the pressure decreases, okay, we can see that there. And it decreases so much that the pressure ends up being lower than in the atrium, okay. And you can see here the pressure in the aorta is actually going to remain very high, okay. We've also got this really interesting little bump over here in the aortic pressure, and that's actually due to something called elastic recoil. So if you imagine the aorta is the largest artery in the body, and it's got an elastic layer of tissue, and that is going to contract and cause this little bump or this little increase in pressure. Okay, finally, we want to talk about what's happening at each of these numbers. So you might want to just pause the video and think about what's happening there. And if you're not sure, maybe as a clue, these numbers represent valves opening or closing. So if you didn't get it initially, maybe pause the video again and see if you can think about which valves are going to be opening or closing at these points. And your next clue is to consider which valve is going to be located between those sections. So for example here, point number 1, these two lines are the atrium and the ventricle, so it can only be the valve that is found between the atrium and ventricle, or the bicuspid valve. At point number 2, the two lines involved here are the aorta and the ventricle, so it can only be the semilunar valve that's found between those two structures. So maybe pause the video and, considering that, have another go at deciding which valves are open and which valves are closed. Okay, so the answers. So number 1, we can see the valve between the atrium and ventricle is the bicuspid valve, and that is located here. And we can see that as the pressure in the ventricle increases above the pressure in the atrium, now because there's a higher pressure in the ventricular blood compared to the lower pressure in the atrium, blood will want to flow from the ventricle into the atrium, but the bicuspid valve is going to slam shut to stop that happening. So at point number 1, the bicuspid valve is going to close. At number 2, you can see here the ventricular pressure now becomes higher than the aortic pressure. Okay, so now we've got higher pressure here. I'm going to put a little H in the ventricle and lower pressure in the aorta. So I've got an L there. So blood, again, will always flow from higher to lower pressure. Sorry about my writing. So the blood will flow from the ventricle into the aorta. So we know from just looking at the graph that therefore the semilunar valve, or the aortic semilunar valve, I'm going to put SL here, must be open to allow blood to flow through. So I'm going to put a little O for open. At point number 3, you can see that the ventricular pressure is going to drop lower than the aortic pressure. Okay, so now the pressure in the aorta is higher than the pressure in the ventricle, which is lower. So at this point here, the semilunar valve is going to slam shut to prevent backflow of blood. So I'm going to put a little C for closed. And then finally at number 4, you can see the pressure in the ventricle is going to drop lower than the pressure in the atrium. And again, we know that the valve that connects the atrium and the ventricles is the bicuspid. So at this point here, the bicuspid valve is going to open and the blood from the atrium is going to start to flow into the ventricle. Okay, and one other thing is, those of you who have Jane, you might have heard her say this before, but this also spells cocoa, closed, open, closed, open. Next, I'd like you to pause the video and to try these cardiac cycle questions. And here are the answers, so maybe just pause the video and check your answers. Please go back to your progress bar and re-review your learning objectives, see if you can move them to a different confidence level. And finally, there's a short Kahoot for you to try to test your knowledge. Okay, thanks.